The sound of shattering glass cut through the morning chatter of Molly's diner like a gunshot. 72-year-old Grace Williams didn't flinch. She'd lived through too much to be startled by broken dishes. What came next, however, would test every ounce of dignity she'd spent a lifetime cultivating. The coffee cup lay in pieces at her feet, dark liquid spreading across the worn linoleum like spilled ink. Grace looked up from where she sat at the counter, her weathered hands still folded peacefully in her lap, and met the eyes of a man whose face was twisted with a rage that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the poison he carried inside. "Why don't you watch where you're going?" "You old—" The man's words were venom, each syllable designed to wound. He was younger, maybe 40, with the kind of hardness that comes from years of blaming the world for his own failures. His voice rose above the clatter of silverware and the hiss of the griddle. "People like you shouldn't even be in here taking up space." Grace said nothing. She'd learned long ago that some storms you couldn't reason with, you just had to weather them. Around her, the diner had gone silent. Forks hung suspended over plates of eggs and hash browns. Even Jerry, the cook who'd been flipping pancakes at Molly's for 23 years, stood frozen with his spatula in midair. "I apologize," Grace said softly, though she'd done nothing wrong. The coffee cup had been placed too close to the edge by a distracted waitress, knocked over by the man's own briefcase as he'd shoved past her seat. But Grace had apologized for things that weren't her fault before. Sometimes an apology was just the price of peace. "You're sorry?" The man leaned closer, and Grace could smell the sourness of his breath, could see the broken capillaries in his cheeks. "You people are always sorry. Sorry and in the way. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present." The man's hand rose, not in a gesture of emphasis, but with clear intention. The slap connected with Grace's cheek with a crack that seemed to echo off the walls, snapping her head to the side. Her reading glasses flew from her face, skittering across the counter to land near the sugar dispenser. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Grace slowly turned her head back, her hand rising to touch her reddening cheek. Her eyes, dark and deep with the wisdom of 7 decades, showed no anger, no hatred, only a profound sadness that such cruelty still existed in the world. A single tear traced its way down her face, not from physical pain, but from the weight of a hatred she'd never deserved, but had endured too many times. "Hey!" A young waitress named Sarah finally found her voice, her tray clattering to the floor. "You can't— Someone call the police!" The man sneered, snatching his briefcase from the counter. "Call whoever you want. Nothing's going to happen. It never does." He threw a $20 bill on the counter with theatrical disdain and stalked toward the door, his shoes crunching over broken ceramic. Sarah rushed to Grace's side, her young face flushed with outrage and shame that she hadn't moved faster, hadn't done more. "Mrs. Williams, I'm so sorry. I'm calling 911 right now." "That man—" Grace gently touched Sarah's wrist, stopping her from reaching for her phone. "It's all right, sweetheart. I've survived worse than a slap and a few ugly words." "It's not all right," said an older gentleman from a nearby booth, his own hands shaking as he set down his coffee. "That was assault. That was—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find words adequate for what they'd all just witnessed. Jerry came around from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. His eyes were wet. "Grace, please, let us call someone." "Your son, doesn't he work for the government? Maybe he could—" "Marcus is very busy," Grace said quietly, carefully retrieving her glasses. One lens had cracked in the fall. "He doesn't need to be bothered with this." But Sarah had already made the call. Not to 911, but to the emergency contact number in Grace's file, which every regular customer at Molly's provided. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, authoritative voice answered. "This is Secretary Williams." Sarah's hand trembled. She'd expected to reach a son, maybe an office worker or a teacher. The title secretary hadn't registered in her panic. "Mr. Williams? This is Sarah Chen from Molly's Diner. Your mother, there's been an incident. She's okay, but a man he struck her, right across the face. We have him on the security camera, and I got his license plate as he left." The silence on the other end lasted only 3 seconds. but in those seconds, Sarah felt the temperature of the call drop by 20 degrees. When Marcus Williams spoke again, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal in its calm. "Is she hurt? Does she need medical attention?" "She says she's fine, but her cheek is red and I'm 12 minutes away." "Keep her there. Make sure she's comfortable, and don't let anyone touch that security footage." The line went dead. Grace heard only Sarah's side of the conversation, but she recognized the tone. "You called Marcus," she said, sighing. "Sarah, honey, you shouldn't have done that. Mrs. Williams, someone just assaulted you. Your son has a right to know." Grace smiled sadly. "You don't understand. Marcus gets protective." 11 minutes later, a convoy of 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of Molly's diner with a precision that spoke of serious government training. Marcus Williams emerged from the center vehicle, and Sarah understood immediately why Grace had sighed. This wasn't just someone who worked for the government. The man who strode through the door wore a suit that cost more than she made in a month, flanked by 2 agents with earpieces and the kind of alertness that suggested they could assess and neutralize any threat in under 2 seconds. But when Marcus saw his mother sitting at the counter with a reddening handprint on her cheek and cracked glasses, his face, the face that had stared down terrorists and cartel leaders, crumbled into something raw and human. Mom. He was at her side in 3 strides, his hands hovering near her face, afraid to touch and cause more pain. "Mom, are you—" "I'm fine, baby." Grace reached up and cupped his cheek, the same way she had when he was 5 years old and had scraped his knee. Just a little rattled. "But I'm fine." Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked at Sarah. "You have footage?" Sarah nodded, already pulling up the diner's security system on her phone. She'd queued up the relevant section. Marcus watched it once, his face expressionless. Then he watched it again. On the 3rd viewing, one of the agents standing nearby actually took a step back from whatever was radiating off him. "His license plate?" Marcus asked, his voice terribly soft. Sarah handed him the paper where she'd scrawled the number. One of the agents was already on his phone, running the plates through databases that most law enforcement agencies couldn't access. "Marcus," Grace said firmly, grabbing her son's hand, "don't do anything you'll regret." "I won't regret anything I'm about to do, Mom. That man is hurting, angry at the world. What he needs is—" "What he needs," Marcus interrupted gently but firmly, "is to understand that there are consequences for his actions. Especially when those actions involve putting his hands on you." The agent ended his call. "Secretary, we have an address. Robert Jennings, 42, lives in Riverside. 2 DUIs, restraining order from an ex-wife, fired from his last 3 jobs." He paused. "He's at work now. Keller Accounting on Madison Street." Marcus looked at his mother one more time, memorizing the mark on her face. Then he turned to Sarah. "Thank you for calling me, and for taking care of her." "We love Mrs. Williams," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "She comes in every Wednesday and Saturday. She remembers everyone's names, asks about our kids, our lives. She's the best of us." Marcus nodded slowly. Then he and his agents were gone, leaving only the rumble of SUV engines in their wake. 27 minutes later, Robert Jennings was escorted out of his office building by local police. The security footage from Molly's diner had been anonymously forwarded to the authorities, along with witness statements and enough legal pressure from the Department of Homeland Security's legal team to ensure the district attorney's office treated this as the priority it was. But Marcus Williams didn't stop there. He made calls, quiet calls to people who owed him favors, to friends in various agencies, to prosecutors who understood that justice sometimes needed a firm hand to guide it. Robert Jennings would face charges. He would go to court. He would have the right to defend himself. Everything would be done legally, properly, by the book. But it would be done. 3 hours after the incident, Marcus returned to Molly's diner. His mother was still there, refusing to leave despite Sarah's attempts to close the diner and take her home. Grace was doing what she always did, helping. She was in the back, teaching Jerry's new hire how to properly fold napkins around silverware, her voice patient and kind. Marcus watched her from the doorway. This woman who had raised him alone after his father died, who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school, who had taught him that strength meant lifting others up, not tearing them down. "You taught me to turn the other cheek," Marcus said quietly when she noticed him. Grace smiled, walking over to embrace her son. "I taught you to be better than the hatred aimed at you. And you are. Getting justice through the right channels, making sure that man faces legal consequences. That's not revenge, baby. That's making sure he doesn't do this to someone else's mother, someone else's grandmother." Marcus held her carefully, mindful of her bruise. He said nothing would happen. "That it never does." "Well," Grace said, pulling back to look up at her son with fierce pride, "today he learned different, not because of who you are or what position you hold, but because what he did was wrong. And wrong things should have consequences, whether the victim is the mother of a cabinet secretary or a homeless woman on the street." "I would burn it all down for you," Marcus said quietly. "All of it. The job, the title, everything." Grace shook her head. "I know you would. That's why I know you won't, because you understand what I've always told you. The power you have isn't for settling personal scores. It's for protecting people who can't protect themselves. Use this moment, Marcus. Use what happened today to remember why you do what you do, to remember who you're really working for." She gestured around the diner where people had slowly returned to their meals, but were watching the exchange with quiet attention. These people, the Sarahs and Jerrys and families just trying to have breakfast. They're who you serve. And if today's events remind you of that, remind you that hatred and cruelty can happen anywhere to anyone, then maybe something good can come from this ugliness. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he addressed the diner at large, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but the humanity of a son who'd just watched his mother be hurt. "What happened here today shouldn't have happened, and I want to thank everyone who stood up, who called the police, who refused to let it be ignored. That's what makes a community strong, not turning away from injustice when it's uncomfortable or scary." He paused, looking at each face. "My mother has been coming to this diner for 15 years. She's told me stories about all of you. Sarah, whose daughter just started college. Jerry, whose son is serving overseas. This place has been her refuge, her community. Thank you for being her family when I couldn't be here." Jerry cleared his throat. "Grace's family. What happened to her happened to all of us." And in that moment, the diner became something more than a place that served breakfast and coffee. It became a testament to the fact that kindness creates bonds stronger than blood, that communities are built by people who show up, who remember names, who care. Robert Jennings was ultimately convicted of assault and hate crime enhancements. He served 8 months in jail and was ordered to complete anger management and community service. But the real story wasn't about his punishment, it was about what Grace Williams did next. She attended his sentencing. She sat in the courtroom, wearing a new pair of glasses, and when given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, she stood and spoke directly to the man who had struck her. "I forgive you," she said simply, "not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me, and I've been hurt enough. I hope that when you leave here, you'll have learned that the color of someone's skin, their age, their perceived place in society, none of that determines their worth. We're all just humans trying to get through this life. Some of us do it with kindness. I hope you'll choose to be one of them." In the gallery, Marcus Williams watched his mother with tears streaming down his face, understanding that true power wasn't about retaliation or revenge. It was about having every right to hate and choosing grace instead. The story spread, not because Marcus wanted it to, but because people needed to hear it. In a world that often seemed consumed by division and cruelty, here was a reminder that dignity could not be stolen, only surrendered. That the measure of a person wasn't found in their title or their position, but in how they treated others when no one was watching and how they responded when everyone was. Molly's Diner became something of a pilgrimage site for a few weeks. People coming from across the city to sit where Grace had sat to understand what real strength looked like. Grace tolerated it with her usual patience, but eventually convinced Jerry to take down the handwritten sign someone had posted about the incident. "This is a place for breakfast and community," she told him firmly. "Not a monument to my bruised cheek. Life returned to normal as it always does." Grace continued her Wednesday and Saturday visits. Marcus continued his impossible job protecting a nation. And Sarah, who had made that critical phone call, learned that sometimes standing up for what's right means taking action even when you're scared, even when you're not sure what will happen next. Years later, when Sarah had her own children and brought them to Molly's diner for their first meal out, Grace was still there, now 85, and moving a bit slower but with the same warm smile. Sarah's daughter asked why everyone seemed to know the elderly woman in the corner booth. Sarah looked at her child and said, "Because she taught us what it means to be human." And in a world that desperately needed that lesson, Grace Williams kept teaching it, one breakfast at a time, proving that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't authority or position or even justice. It was simply kindness, persisting in the face of cruelty, refusing to be diminished, shining steadily like a light that no darkness could extinguish.